Now, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Digital Innovation Strategy Leader and author of The Trust Economy, Kristian Diekhoner.
Morning. Morning, everyone. It is fantastic to be here. It's my first time in Vegas, and I arrived a couple days early, and so I went for a drive. Hired myself a convertible, and yesterday I found myself in White Hills, Arizona, on some very, very deserted road. And then I pulled over, and I got stuck in the sand. Big time. Now, this is a brand new, rear-wheel drive convertible. There's no way you're going to get out alone. And think of all the things that come into your mind at that point. Oh my God, am I going to make it in time to the event? What if I have to stay here forever? I did not have cellular reception. Is anybody going to rescue me? Am I going to die? In actual fact, lucky me, 10 minutes later, a wonderful dude named Larry arrived in a Jeep with a winch. And he got me out there in minutes. But you see how important trust is in everyday life, right? I was just going to flag down a stranger and ask him to help me tow my car. What would he have to accept, right, at this point? What if he doesn't like me? What if he just drives on? What if he takes my stuff? It all went well. And I think the point here is wonderful things happen when people trust each other. And now, when I got back to Vegas, I asked, why is it that people do events in Vegas? And the reality is people told me, well, it's a surefire way to insert that people attend. If you do an event in Vegas, people will show up, okay? And I thought, hey, that means people trust that when they go to Vegas, they'll have a great time. And maybe they'll trust that they'll get lucky too. Never know. Right, okay? Feel me? So, here's the thing. Trust is very important. You all know this because you're the top of the crop. You know how to make people trust you because of that, you sell things or you facilitate some transactions. Now, one thing is trusting a place because you want to have a great time. But in your industry, it's a lot harder than that, right? Because when somebody wants to buy or sell a house, it's not a gamble. They want to make sure that they trust the right person. They want to make sure they're served the right way. So by virtue of that, and by virtue of you excelling at your job, you're already very good at building trust. And my passion topic is trust. And I want to sort of give you some more perspective on trust today. Why it matters, how it's important, how to build it, so that you guys can be even better at doing what you already do well. All right, I call this the trust economy. So let's get right in. It's strangely familiar, right? Because let's say you got here with an Uber, maybe you took a Lyft, maybe you just walked down, doesn't matter. But companies and apps that build trust between strangers are in our everyday lives. They're perfectly normal. And maybe 10 years ago, your parents, or maybe even like your friends would have told you not to trust others, right? Not to trust strangers. Nowadays, look at the world we live in. We trust strangers on a daily basis. So technology has changed the trust game quite a lot. And if we really go back to where we come from, we see that it's not exactly new, right? Society and economy are built on trust. In fact, in 1997, Francis Fukuyama already observed that the world's most trusted economies and the world's most trusted companies thrive because trust is so core to our economy. Every business is built on trust, and especially businesses that involve heavy interactions between people and high-value transactions. So if you look at, kind of an intermediary business, it's ultimately in the business of trust. And as you all know, the value that that trust intermediation generates is huge. Now, you might be familiar with this quote, right? Which is about how companies like Uber don't own any vehicles, Facebook doesn't own any content. The bottom line is that what's on the rise are these digital trust intermediaries. And the question is, how do these digital trust intermediaries interlace with what you guys do, which is providing the right kind of human touch so that people feel comfortable executing a transaction? Because what technology is doing is it's transforming trust. It's transforming who we trust, it's transforming what we trust, and it's transforming how we trust. And it does that often through very, very simple and unassuming interfaces. And the question is, why does that happen? The answer, or one of the answers for you, is that ultimately, data is the new gold, right? Because the difference between a stranger online and a stranger in public, offline, is that you have a lot of data about the stranger online. And that data, hopefully, allows you to trust them better. So in order to make trust very tangible for you, I'd like to reframe trust, because when I wrote my book on trust, I checked out all the definitions on trust in the dictionary. And some of them, went on for a paragraph or two. I read one academic definition that went on for a page, and I was like, that's not very practical, right? So let's redefine trust a bit more pragmatically. The way I see trust is that trust is just the value that we realize in economic or social interactions. And if you look at trust being equivalent to value, you see that it's actually a great measure of how the world does business. Because nowadays, right, things like social capital and relationship capital are measurable because we have technology to track these things. We have millions or tens of millions of people connecting online, creating social and relationship capital, and we can measure that. In the past, that happened too, but we couldn't measure it. So, to look at this in a very, very tangible way now, collective trust is the world's most profound economic power. So the collective things that we trust in tend to be extremely valuable, like when Apple broke the trillion-dollar market cap, right? It's that collective trust of shareholders, of customers, of people that makes this so valuable. And this means that trust is a pivotal factor in ensuring that you maximize the value you create. Example, trust has this ability to create mental monopolies. And this means that you may believe that your phone of a certain brand or your car of a certain brand is the best phone or car in the world, that there are no alternatives to it. Of course, realistically speaking, there's always an alternative, right? We're looking at a very competitive industry in most markets, and therefore there's always an alternative. But if brands and people manage to make their customers think that they are the only option for them, they're creating mental monopolies. And this is what being the most trusted person or company does to you. And now if we look at the inside of organizations, it's the same story. The Best Place to Work Institute did several studies on what makes the best workplace. And we find that the best workplaces, the most effective places to work, and the most pleasant places to work are characterized by one thing: trust. I didn't make this up. This comes up every year in their findings. So trust powers the most important and most successful organizations. Look at this orchestra, right? It's a very, very simple and perhaps slightly cliche example, but in an orchestra, you have a lot of very highly skilled people that work to a large level of coordination. Yet nobody dictates what they're supposed to do or directs how they're supposed to play. What simply happens is that somebody coordinates them, because the conductor trusts that each of these people in the orchestra is very well able to perform their job. Now, if you look at you guys, right, you're essentially a giant orchestra of people, and you're ultimately orchestrating a service for your customers, right, and for your stakeholders. So people need to trust you, because when people trust you, you will be able to pass on that trust. And the more trust there is in any economic system, the more trust there is in any transaction, the more value gets generated for everyone. And the thing is here, this is why certain cities, certain people, certain companies, and certain beliefs are so dominant and so successful, is because they are so trusted. So in the end of the day, I'm going to get to a point where I'm going to show you the book methodology of how to build trust effectively, how to sort of trust hack your way to the top. But I first want to go on to why it matters so much, Because when you look at, let's say a couple years back, the global financial crisis, we also figured that the moment that trust leaves the system, value always leaves with it. We know that this happened to some tech companies as well, where, there was a lot of trust, perhaps, sometimes blind trust, and, when that sort of then things went wrong, that trust obviously left, and that value left with it. Whether that's in the form of market cap or word of mouth or sentiment, doesn't matter. But whenever trust leaves, value will leave with it. And now let's go back to the good old world, the offline world that we all still live in, right? In the offline world, we have things like passport controls, we have things like background checks. So the offline world is determined not by trust, but very often by distrust. On the streets, you often look over your shoulder. You may not trust a stranger by default. And that's only right because industrialization, like living in large cities, and urbanization, right, living in these giant concentrated settlements, it's encouraged humans to develop this necessary distrust. Like, we have to distrust. We can't really help it, We need to distrust our fellow person because you don't know where they're coming from, you don't have any data about them, and they might otherwise, just abuse any trust that you give them. So the world that we live in the offline world, is very much characterized by distrust. And when you see how digital technology is now getting people to trust each other again, it's taking a very, very different dynamic. When in the old world, we used to distrust by default, now we trust by default. And this is enabled by digital interfaces and data. And of course, the result of that digital interface and that data is that something becomes potentially trustworthy. It becomes easier to trust. And that is, in the end, facilitated through humanizing technology, right? It's facilitated through making things easy for the customer. And that is ultimately where people come in. The idea is that technology can make trust building simpler, but there's still a human connection to be formed, right? So I think it's very important to appreciate the influence of technology in trust building and the way that's changing the patterns of trust in human society. Now, if we look at what's wrong with the old world, it's very apparent because the old world is inefficient and constrained because of distrust. Just think about legal contracts. Think about all these paragraphs. Think about all the effort involved in ensuring trust in a world where distrust is considered a safe and useful way of doing things. Distrust costs a lot of time, and it costs a lot of money, and it costs a lot of value. And the reason technology companies are doing so well is because they can move away from that status quo, and they can help us trust more easily. They basically reduce the effort it takes for us to trust one another. And this is great for all of you because we've started out with this, right? You guys are in the business of trust. So if something can make it easier for you to build trust and facilitate that value creation, then obviously that's good for everyone in this room. But the question then is, if we look at today's brands, and if we look at the way we go about today's lives, customer experiences, are they really as good as they used to be? Are we still as humane as we used to be? The reality, in my view, is that things have scaled so fast, and things are so big nowadays, that very often the kind of experience that you get from technology alone may not be that great. And that's sort of the real differentiator, is being able to use technology to offer a better experience, to offer more customization, to offer something that's unique to the individual, because that's what people will want, right? And I think the interesting thing on an industry level is that when trust in the established players goes down, it gives room for startups, or even for new entrants, to kind of disrupt that status quo. It allows new people to shift trust in their favor, okay? So here we go. Startups that shift trust in their favor, they innovate. And this is why I define innovation in terms of trust, is innovation happens whenever trust shifts from an established way of doing things to a new way of doing things. So this is really important because this is the history of humanity, has shown this several times, right? So technology always advanced that kind of shift. If you look at the carriage here, right? People had to trust that a horseless cart, as they call the automobile, was a better way of getting around. People had to trust that first, right? It wasn't natural, right? So whenever something shifts in the world, it means that trust shifts with it. Technology alone will not do the trick, because if people don't believe that it's a better experience, they won't go to that new solution. Let me start 10,000 years back, when humans were nomadic and we moved to agriculture. Things changed because in settlements we were able to produce larger civilizations. But of course there were also drawbacks, right? Whenever you trust in something new, it doesn't mean that everything else is great now. It means that you're kind of solving a few problems, like agriculture solved problems of small societies. It solved problems of maybe not enough food, but it also created new problems. And every trust shift in the world, in the history of humanity, has solved problems, but it's also created new problems. I want to go to the one that you will all be very familiar with, which happened a few thousand years ago, where trust shifted away from personal trading relationships to trust in money. Right? Money is nothing but a symbol of trust. Money is a way of exchanging value with other people based on a symbolic token. And as a professor in Germany told me, money is a way of doing business with people you don't like. Right. But relationships are having a big comeback right now. it is no longer possible or desired to just do business on the basis of money alone, a transactional business. But of course, you guys know this, every business that involves a high-value item or something personal and emotional and close to people's hearts requires more than that. And we know the drawbacks that money has caused in the world, right? It's not all fun and games. So money as well has had lots of great effects, but it's also been somewhat detrimental. The same goes to things like industrialization, right? When trust moved away from manual craftsmanship to industrialized scale, lots of good things happen, but some bad things too. And then this obviously moved to the next big shift in the world, which is where trust moved away from local production to globalized trade. This is the world we live in right now. And now there's another shift happening in the world right now. I already hinted at it earlier. It's a super significant shift. Trust in corporations is moving now towards trust in data-driven intermediaries. This is very important because it means the world is decentralizing. We used to trust institutions. We used to trust large corporations by default. We used to trust anything that was big and centralized. And that was the way that we went about organizing our societies. But nowadays, that trust is shifting back to the people again. And people nowadays build trust facilitated by data and by digital intermediaries. So that means, each of you obviously is fairly independent. You guys have your own business. You guys are in charge of what you do. So this means that you are empowered by this shift. Because it means that in the end, the individual factor, the human factor, is counting more again. And there's a democratization happening here, which is super crucial. Because it's kind of eroding established power structures. It's the democratization of information, and this means that you can't really control what people see about you because it's out there. And you just have to deal with it. But the thing, and the reason why people trust technology so much is because technology has made great experiences so accessible and cheap. Think of this, right? This would have cost you a helicopter flight and a very, very expensive piece of kit 30 years ago. Nowadays, a couple $100 from Amazon. Easy, right? Technology makes great experiences simple. Yet there's so much information now that it's hard to navigate all of this. How do we navigate this? And this means that the idea of creating trust for the right choice is more important than ever. Because what each one of you does, probably on a daily basis, is reassure people that they're making the right decision, that they have evaluated all the options, and that they're in good hands, right? This is super important, and this is also why technology companies that help us do that are so significant. That's why they do so well. Because every customer journey nowadays, doesn't matter whether you like it or not, it has digital touchpoints. So whether you are present online, the customer will search for you at some point in time, right? And the interesting aspect is that because there is such a default faith put in technology and put in, search, people kind of treat a lot of that information they get with a lot of authority. So it's no longer a world in which you can say, this is how it is, and you just have to accept it. There's even stories of people at the doctors actually Googling what they have and recommending the doctor what they should be prescribed. This is the world we live in, guys, right? And I'm sure that that has a very profound impact on how people have to operate, because it means that the way in which we trust, in which we obtain information, is completely being turned around. And that obviously means, and you will like this, never ever before has customer centricity been more important. Because the customer is not going to buy an empty promise. The customer is not going to buy a standardized offer. The customer, more than ever, wants things to be very specifically adjusted just to them. And they want to feel like they are making a decision based on all the available information. They want to feel a connection. They want to feel authenticity and a genuine sense of comfort. But all of this is not possible when you standardize. You need to do this by providing your individual touch. And that is sort of how you're able to actually convince the customer to trust you. Of course, there's a bit more to that. Trust is a lot more difficult than just convincing the customer that you're in good hands, but this is kind of the start. And if you look at where people turn to nowadays when they have unknowns, the answer more than often is data, because data turns unknowns into knowns. And we're so used to that on a daily basis that for, every morning commute, we'll still use Google Maps. We perfectly know the way, but we'll still use Google Maps, just because we're more comfortable that way. And maybe because we get some additional information from that, right? So there is all these patterns in day-to-day life that just so happen to be almost intuitive nowadays. The first thing we reach for when we need information is not our fellow person, it's the phone. Imagine you're in a big crowd, okay? Big crowds happen here in Vegas. So you're standing around, you want to know where to go. Do you ask for directions? Well, most people, they'll check on their phone first. There's a ton of people around them. Some of them may even be local, but no, we check our phone first. That's how much we trust technology. And this is very important for you guys, because I don't see it as a threat. I see it as an enrichment. I think it allows people to have more information, the right information. And honestly, if you guys do a great job, you have nothing to fear, right? Everybody who does a great job in this world has nothing to fear of this, because it just means that people will find out the truth about you more easily. That's good, right? However, data becomes the new economy because trust is shifting to technology. And that means a lot of what we do must be looked at in generating the right kind of data and using that data for the right kind of purposes and taking people along so that that data is being used in the right way. Okay, so if you want the best quality customer interaction and the best quality customer data, it means that you need deep trust on your side. Okay? So the more trust you have with customers, the more data they'll give you. And in a way then, trust earns privileged access to customers to deliver a unique proposition, which is really the business you're in. And this is what's going to make you sticky, right? So in the end, like, if you have the greatest customer access, you'll be the most successful, period. And this means that we need to be transparent and build very high trust relationships, of course. So I have a model for that, which can help you. This model is straight from the book, so you don't have to buy it. Here we go. This is the trust model, okay? So we start with perception. Perception is all about reputation. It's about how you appear. This tells the customer whether they're even wanting to engage with you. Then you go to temptation, which is about providing that taste test. Like, what is going to hook your customer, right? What is going to make them engage with you? And then you go to the stage of connection, which is all about humanness. It's about speaking the customer's language, you know, understanding their concerns, being a true friend, being real. So there's several dozen factors that go into each, but this is just a very, very broad model. And think of the first three stages as like a trust offer. So that's where you offer your customer to trust you. And then the second sort of part of this 6 stages is the customer then answering to that trust and saying, okay, I'm going to now, first of all, validate whether you're trustworthy. This is where the customer will try and look at you and say, you know, do they practice what they preach? Are they authentic? Are they really a right partner? And whether a request for information. The more easy you make it for people to find the truth about you, the better you'll do here. And then you go to the stage of attachment and affiliation. Attachment is about loyal, relatively passive kind of interaction, which is basically comfort. And then affiliation, that's when people talk about you, rave about you, you know, where you get all that word of mouth. Now, this happens on the Zillow level, this happens on your individual level. It happens at both stages. But those stages are increasingly intertwined because the customer just sees one experience, right? In the end, for the customer, there's one experience. So, when you go through this, there's a lot to digest. Trust intermediaries will always be around, right? When when travel reservation moved away from offices, it moved to Expedia or other companies. Intermediation will always be there. It will just change in its form factor. And it will become more data-driven and more intuitive for the customer. And this is super crucial because it means that there's an opportunity for all of us to use data, transparency, and technology to our favor, right? So I want to quickly go back and remind you of this trust sequence. Okay, so we have a proactive part, which is you providing and propositioning to the customer, the first 3 stages. And then we have a reactive phase where the customer then answers. And when all of that happens, you lead to word of mouth. Because if people believe that what you're doing is worth sharing with their friends and their circle, they're essentially kind of giving you a seal of trust, right? And that's the best thing that can ever happen to any one of you. When somebody says, you know, I work with X, Y, Z, it was really amazing, you should too. That's the most powerful thing you can get. And that feeds back into the perception stage. So it's kind of a bit cyclical if you want to look at it that way. That's what you want to get to, right? There are, in the end, several things you can do in each of these stages to do a great job. The most important takeaway here is that if you look at trust in a strategic way, you can obviously be a lot better at building it than if you just, kind of intuitively do it. Now, many of you will have been in the industry for a long time, so you will have a very, very strong intuitive concept of how to build trust. But looking at this through the strategic methodology lens might actually make it easier for you to do this really well. And then kind of if you look at the overall context of Zillow, think of data being a core aspect of helping you do your job better. But let's not just talk about data and technology, because data and technology hasn't made life better all the time. It's sometimes made life worse as well. And the really important thing is that whatever you do with trust and you do with technology, it's a bit like in Star Wars, the Force, right? You can use trust and technology for good, or you can use it for bad stuff. And that's really up to you in the end. But in my view, if you look at a world in which we can trust each other more, and if you look in a world in which we're unafraid to be transparent and to be honest, we're ultimately creating a world that, on the one hand, creates wealth for everyone involved, but it also makes us a lot happier at what we do. And I think there's an interesting aspect is that, this idea of happiness and the idea of kind of, looking at what our society is lacking is very often going back to this idea that we are still in the offline world dealing with a lot of distrust. And that in the world at large right now, there's a lot of distrust of one country towards the other, or people towards another. So in the end, trust makes things a lot better and a lot more interesting. And there is one study that, to me, really it really drives what I do. It's a study on oxytocin, the happiness and relationship hormone. Maybe you've heard of it before. It had a bit of a hype a couple of years ago. Oxytocin is very prominent. And this study found that the best way to make somebody trust you is to inject them with oxytocin. It's a hormone. Now, this is not my recommendation for you today. But I think what's very interesting is that the more happy we are, the more we trust. And vice versa. The more we trust, the more happy we are. And this matters because in the end, that's what we're all searching for at some point, right? And think of this. What if we can create a world and an economy in which high trust leads to lots of value, but also leads to a happier world? And this is why, personally, for me, I believe that the trust economy isn't just a better way of doing business. It's not just the way that we should be operating in future. But for me, the trust economy is the blueprint for ultimately a better world in the way that we operate, in the way that we go about our daily lives, in the way that we build relationships, and in the way that we do business. And this is why the trust economy, to me, is the happy economy. And I want to encourage all of you today and in the future to be part and contribute to building that happy economy. Thank you very much.